The battle is the part that survives. It is the part painted on the columns and carved into the arches. The clash of shields and the rout of the enemy. The moment a campaign is decided in an afternoon of blood. And it is, in almost every case, the least important part of the story. Long before two armies met, one of them had usually already been beaten or saved by a problem that no monument ever celebrates and no historian of the dramatic school ever lingers on. It had been beaten or saved by the question of how to put food into the mouths of 50,000 men and the thousands of animals that moved with them, every single day, in a countryside that was being stripped bare beneath their feet while the whole vast mass kept moving. This is the logistics tale of a Roman army, and it was the real engine of Roman power. The legions did not conquer the world because their soldiers were braver than other men. They conquered it because Rome solved, more reliably than its enemies, the problem of feeding an army on the march. Begin with the sheer physical scale of the thing, because the numbers are what make the achievement almost unbelievable. A large Roman field army of 50,000 men was not a crowd. It was a city on legs, larger than most cities that existed in the ancient world, and unlike a city, it had no surrounding farmland feeding it from a fixed place. A working soldier on campaign needed somewhere on the order of 2 to 3 pounds of grain a day as the foundation of his diet, the bulk of his calories coming from wheat in one form or another. Multiply even a conservative ration across 50,000 men and the army was consuming dozens of tons of grain every day before a single animal was fed. Over a month of campaigning, that figure climbed into the many hundreds of tons, a quantity of food that had to be found, moved, and distributed continuously, in the right place, at the right time, or the army began to starve. An army that starves does not fight. It disintegrates, deserts, or surrenders. And it does so faster than most people imagine, because hungry men lose discipline and strength long before they actually die. And the men were only part of the appetite. The animals were the hidden multiplier that turned a hard problem into an almost impossible one. A field army of this size dragged behind it thousands upon thousands of horses and mules and oxen. Cavalry mounts, pack mules carrying the baggage, draft animals hauling the carts, the herds of replacement and spare animals. Every one of those beasts ate. And a horse or mule ate several times what a man ate, demanding both hard fodder like barley and a constant supply of green grazing, along with quantities of water that dwarfed what the men needed. Here lies one of the cruelest arithmetic traps in all of pre-modern logistics. The animals you bring to carry the army's food are themselves eating that food as they walk. Over a long enough distance, a pack mule consumes the entire weight it can carry, which means that beyond a certain range, land transport feeds nothing but itself. The further you have to haul supplies over land, the more of those supplies the haulage eats on the way, until the effort produces nothing. This single fact, more than any other, shaped where and how Rome could fight. What were all these men and animals actually eating? The legionary diet was, above everything else, a diet of grain. This is a point worth dwelling on, because the popular image of the Roman soldier as a great devourer of roasted meat is mostly a fantasy. The modern study of the Roman army, above all the detailed work of the historian Jonathan Roth on military logistics, has established that wheat was the overwhelming foundation of the soldier's food, supplemented by other things but never replaced by them. The grain was eaten as bread, as a thick porridge the Romans called pulse, and as a hard twice-baked biscuit that kept for a long time on campaign. Around that core sat the supplements that made the diet bearable and balanced: bacon and salt pork, cheese, lentils and beans and chickpeas, olive oil, salt, vegetables when they could be had, and a thin sour wine, often little more than vinegar mixed with water, that the soldiers drank in vast quantities. Meat was real, and it was present, from herds driven with the army, from hunting, from the animals sacrificed in religious rites. But it was a supplement to the grain, not the basis of survival. An army marched on its wheat. The way that wheat was handled tells you a great deal about how the Roman system actually worked at the level of the individual soldier. Grain was issued to the men not as flour and not as finished bread, but very often as whole, unground wheat. There was a hard logistical reason for this. Whole grain keeps for a long time, resisting damp and spoilage, while flour goes bad quickly and bread faster still. So the army carried its food in the most durable form possible and pushed the work of turning it into something edible down onto the soldiers themselves. Each small squad of 8 men, the group that shared a tent and a mule, also shared a hand mill, a small heavy quern of 2 stone discs that the men turned by hand to grind their grain ration into flour. From that flour they made their own bread, baking it in the camp ovens or cooking flat cakes on hot stones. The Roman army was, at its lowest level, a vast collection of men who ground and baked their own daily bread, every squad its own little bakery, a system that traded the soldiers' labor for the enormous logistical advantage of carrying food in a form that would not rot. The soldier himself was made into a beast of burden to lighten the supply train, and this was a deliberate reform that defined the late Roman army. The general Gaius Marius is credited with the change that gave the legionary his enduring nickname, the Mule of Marius, because he ordered his men to carry so much of their own equipment and provisions on their backs that they resembled the pack animals they were replacing. The logic was inescapable. Every day of rations a soldier carried himself was a day of rations that did not need a mule, and every mule you could leave behind was an animal you did not have to feed, water, and protect. So the Roman soldier marched under a crushing load. His weapons, his armor, his shield, his entrenching tools for building the fortified camp every single night, his cooking gear, and on his back a sack of grain that could amount to as much as half a month's rations at a time. The army accepted the punishing burden on its men in exchange for a shorter, faster, less hungry baggage train. A force that carried its own food on its own shoulders for 2 weeks was a force that could strike deep and move fast, without the supply line catching up. Then there was water, the tyrant that ruled everything in his mentioned least. Food could be carried, stored, and rationed across days and weeks. Water could not in the quantities an army of this size demanded. 50,000 men and their thousands of animals needed an immense volume of water every day, water that was far too heavy and bulky to haul in bulk over any distance. The consequence was absolute. The army was chained to its water sources. The route a Roman army took across a landscape was dictated less by the shortest path or the best road than by the question of where the men and beasts could drink. The length of a day's march was often set not by how far the men could walk, but by the distance between one reliable water source and the next. Rivers, springs, and lakes were not scenery on the campaign map. They were the arteries that determined whether the army could exist at all in a given place. And a general who marched his army into dry country without a plan for water was a general about to destroy his own force without an enemy lifting a sword. So how did Rome actually get the food to where the army was? There were, in essence, 3 methods, and a great army used all of them at once, shifting between them as the situation demanded. The first was to take it from the land the army was passing through, by foraging and requisition, gathering grain and fodder and livestock from the surrounding countryside, whether by purchase from the locals, by formal levy on a friendly province, or by simple plunder in enemy territory. The second was the supply line, the steady forwarding of provisions from a secure base in the rear up to the army in the field, an umbilical cord of carts and pack trains and boats that had to be protected along its entire length. The third was the magazine, the depot, a stockpile of food and fodder gathered and stored in advance at a fortified point, often laid down before a campaign even began so the army would find supplies waiting along its intended line of advance. To these 3, a fourth presence always attached itself: the traders and sutlers who followed the army to sell it goods, the camp market that sprang up wherever the legions halted. A skilled Roman commander juggled all of these continuously, drawing on the land here, calling forward the supply train there, falling back on a pre-stocked magazine when the country was too poor, and the whole campaign was in a real sense a feeding operation with battles inserted into it. Underlying all 3 methods was an economic fact that shaped the entire geography of Roman warfare. Moving bulk food by water was vastly cheaper and easier than moving it by land. A single river barge or coastal ship could carry a quantity of grain that would have required hundreds of mules or carts to haul the same distance over land. And the land transport, as we have seen, ate much of its own cargo on the way. The Romans understood this in their bones, even without the language of economics, and it explains a pattern that runs through their entire military history. The legions clustered on the great navigable rivers, the Rhine and the Danube above all, and campaigns were planned to follow rivers and coastlines wherever possible, because those were the highways down which bulk supply could actually flow. The famous Roman roads, for all their engineering glory, were built primarily for marching soldiers, for messengers, and for moving troops fast, not for hauling the immense tonnage of grain an army ate. Bulk food went by water whenever water was available, and the strategic map of where Rome could project lasting power was, to a striking degree, the map of where its ships and barges could reach. Feeding the army across years and provinces required something beyond any single supply train. It required a state machine for extracting and forwarding grain on an imperial scale. Much of the food that ultimately reached the legions came from taxes collected not in coin, but in kind, in grain, levied across the provinces and gathered into the system that supplied the armies and the city of Rome itself. The great grain-producing regions of the empire, the fields of Egypt, the vast harvests of North Africa, the wheat of Sicily, and the rich provinces of Gaul, fed the soldiers on the frontiers through an administrative apparatus that collected, stored, transported, and distributed food across thousands of miles. This was governance as logistics, a bureaucracy whose central purpose was to ensure that the men on the Rhine and the Danube and the eastern deserts had bread. The Roman army's power to remain in the field year after year, in places far from any farmland it controlled directly, rested on this unglamorous machinery of taxation and transport. The empire was, in one of its essential functions, an organization for moving grain to soldiers. When the army was on campaign and beyond the easy reach of its depots, it lived in large part by foraging, and foraging was a dangerous, organized, and time-consuming operation, rather than the casual scavenging the word suggests. The army sent out specialized parties under guard, foragers to gather grain, others to cut and collect fodder for the animals, water carriers to fill the supply, woodcutters to bring in fuel for the fires that baked the bread. These parties had to range out from the main body, sometimes for considerable distances once the immediate area was exhausted, and they were acutely vulnerable. An enemy who understood logistics did not need to fight the main army at all. He could ambush the foraging parties, pick off the supply train, and starve the great host into retreat or into a battle on unfavorable ground. And there was a deeper limit built into the whole method. An army of 50,000 men and their animals stripped the countryside around it with terrifying speed, eating out the grain, the fodder, and the grazing for miles in a matter of days. This is why a large army could never sit still for long in one place unless it was being fed from outside. It consumed its surroundings and then had to move on to fresh country simply to keep eating, which meant that the rhythm of a campaign was set as much by the exhaustion of the land as by any strategic plan. The enemies of Rome understood all of this, and the most effective of them learned to attack the food rather than the soldiers. The deadliest counter to an invading Roman army was not always a battle. It was the deliberate destruction of everything the invader needed to eat. A defender who burned his own crops, emptied his own granaries, drove off his own livestock, and poisoned or blocked the wells turned his homeland into a desert that no army could cross, scorching the earth to deny the invader the supplies that the invader had to find locally because he could not carry them all. Faced with such tactics, even the most powerful army was confronted with a choice between retreat and slow starvation. Logistics, in these moments, became a weapon as sharp as any sword, and the contest between two armies became a contest over who could keep eating longest. The general who could feed his men 1 week more than his enemy could feed theirs would win without ever forming a line of battle, because the starving army would break first. No campaign shows the absolute supremacy of supply over glory more clearly than Julius Caesar's wars in Gaul, and the proof comes from Caesar's own pen. In the commentaries he wrote about those campaigns, one anxiety surfaces again and again, more constant than any worry about the enemy's numbers or courage, and that anxiety is grain. Early in the Gallic Wars, as Caesar pursued the migrating Helvetii, he found himself in a crisis that had nothing to do with battle and everything to do with bread. He had been promised grain by his Gallic allies, the Aedui, and the grain did not come, held back by men within that people who had their own designs. Caesar describes how close he was pushed to the edge, with the day approaching on which he would have had to issue the last of his grain to the soldiers, and would then have had nothing left. The most formidable general of the ancient world, at the head of his legions, was brought to the brink not by an enemy army, but by a failure of supply, and he was forced to bend his entire strategy around the desperate need to secure food. The war he is remembered for winning was, in his own telling, a war he very nearly lost to an empty granary. The same campaigns produced the supreme example of warfare as a logistics contest in the Siege of Alesia, where Caesar trapped the great Gallic leader Vercingetorix and his army inside a hilltop stronghold. Caesar's solution was to build a ring of fortifications around the town, to starve it into surrender. And the siege became a slow strangulation in which the defenders' food ran out under the pressure of the encirclement. The Gauls inside were so reduced that they expelled their own non-combatants to save their dwindling supplies, and those people were left to starve in the no-man's land between the walls. While Caesar squeezed the town, a vast Gallic relief army gathered behind him, so that the besiegers were themselves besieged, caught between the starving garrison and the relieving host, and now it was Caesar's own supply that came under the same deadly pressure he was applying to his enemy. The whole tremendous engagement, one of the decisive moments in the conquest of Gaul, turned on the question of which side's food and which side's nerve would give out first. The earlier Gallic strategy in those wars had pointed at the same truth. When Vercingetorix urged his people to burn their own towns and crops to leave the Romans nothing to eat, accepting the ruin of their own country as the price of starving the invader out. They grasped, as Caesar grasped, that the war would be decided by grain. This is the part of Roman warfare that no triumphal monument ever depicts, and that most retellings pass over in silence. And it is the part that did the most to build and hold the empire. The legions are remembered for their discipline in battle, their engineering, their iron formations, and all of that was real. But beneath the visible army of fighting men ran an invisible army of grain and fodder and water, of handmills and pack mules and river barges, of foraging parties and provincial granaries, and the immense administrative effort of moving food to wherever the soldiers happened to be standing. The limits of that hidden system were the true limits of Roman power. Rome could fight where it could feed its army and not 1 mile beyond. It could campaign through the season when the grass grew to fodder the animals, and not through the dead of winter when nothing grew, which is why armies went into winter quarters and waited for the spring. It could project lasting force along the rivers and coasts, where bulk grain could travel, and only fleetingly into the dry interior where it could not. The conquest of the ancient world was, at its foundation, a triumph of supply, and the soldiers who won the battles were carried to those battles on the backs of mules and the decks of grain barges and the grinding stones of 10,000 squads baking their own bread. The tale that nobody shows was the thing that made the army an army at all.